We're looking here in the Sermon on the Mount, listening to the King. We're looking here at Matthew 5, verses 31 to 37, under the title this evening, Keeping Your Promises. So let's read that passage together. Matthew 5, and beginning at verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you've heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Amen. So we're looking at this passage here, keeping your promises. And we've got to remember that this relates to what Jesus said in verse 20, when he said to those who belong to the kingdom that their righteousness had to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, which was a shocking statement. But he is speaking about how the righteousness of those belong to him, it isn't just an outward conformity to the law, but it's in their hearts, transformed hearts. And we saw that when Jesus spoke about lust and also about hatred, that do not murder. It's not just about not killing people outwardly, but not killing people in our hearts, not hating them. And committing adultery is not just about our outward actions, but not committing it in our hearts, not lusting after other people. Now, we move on here and we're looking at this section about keeping your promises. And we're thinking, first of all, about keeping your marriage promises in verses 31 to 32. Now, this teaching on divorce follows on from and is linked to what Jesus said about preventing sexual sin in our hearts in verses 27 to 30. The concern here is stopping others and stopping ourselves from sinning. Remember when he spoke about lust, if your eye causes you sin, to cut it out or cut off your hand. He speaks about that as well. So it's in the context of speaking about taking the necessary action to stop you sinning that he now comes to the subject of divorce. So very much his thinking is not causing ourselves or causing others to sin. Now, in verse 31, Jesus initially here is alluding to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4, where Moses demands that when a woman is divorced, that her husband will give her a certificate of divorce. Now, this wasn't because Moses wanted divorces to happen, but it was where divorces happen to protect the wife who is divorced, because her husband could say, after a while, I didn't divorce her, and then she could be stoned for adultery. So if a wife's divorced, her husband had to say to her, or had to give her a certificate of divorce. And part of that certificate of divorce included a clear statement that she had the right to remarry. And as well as protecting the wife, this also would have indeed been a restraint on divorce, where a man, when he thinks about, well, if I divorce my wife, she could go and marry another, would maybe hold him back a wee bit in what he did. Now, we've got to remember, in Jewish society at that time, only men could divorce their wives. Women did not have the right to divorce their husbands. Women's rights were very limited in those days. Now, when it came to a husband divorcing his wife, there were different schools of thought among the Jewish rabbis about when a divorce could take place. Shammai was one of the more stricter of the rabbis, and he taught that adultery was the only grounds for divorce, sexual immorality, the only grounds which a husband could divorce his wife. Hillel, on the other hand, he taught that divorce could be permitted even for trivial things, even if a wife spoiled the dinner, then her husband could divorce her. Another rabbi called Akiba taught that divorce was allowed even if a husband saw a woman who was fairer than his wife, prettier than his wife, then he had the right to divorce. So you got to remember that's the background when Jesus comes to this subject here. And in the above reasons for divorce, men in their thinking about divorce were thinking about themselves. And what Jesus is wanting here is men to think about the position that they would be putting their wives in when they divorce them. Look what he says in verse 32. He says there, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. Women who were divorced would have been in a very dire financial situation, and their main hope of any financial security in the future would have been found in getting married again. And in those situations, marriage wasn't as much an option for a divorced woman, it was a necessity for a divorced woman for her to be able to survive in the years ahead. And if this happens for reasons other than adultery, Jesus is teaching that when a husband divorces his wife, he is really forcing his wife into the sin of adultery when she would then remarry someone else. So Jesus is giving a very high view of marriage, a view of divorce which is not favourable at all, but he is very aware that we live in a world where things are messed up and marriages sadly get messed up. What Jesus is saying here is trying to get the man to think thoughtfully about his wife and the position that she would be in. Not just about what he wanted, not just about what he desired, but to think about his wife. This was very radical for a society where women were often just seen as property with little or no rights at all. And so what Jesus is saying here is this, you think about the implications of your actions on your wife. It was so radical. Leading on from this previous section on lust, this passage shows us that the best way of preventing sexual sin, whether sexual sin physically or sexual sin in our thoughts, is by the strengthening of marriages. And so the way to avoid sin is to promote what is good. So, keeping your marriage promises, that's the first thing that we see there. And then the second thing we see there is keeping promises in everyday life in verses 35 to 33 to 37. Now, this question of oaths follows on from the discussion on divorce. And it follows on quite naturally because oaths and the keeping of your oaths are an important part of marriage. Now, what Jesus says in verse 33 was believed to have been a rabbinical summary, a summary by rabbis of Old Testament passages, such as Numbers 30 and verse 2 and Deuteronomy 23:21, would say, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. So, those Old Testament passages is that when you make a vow, when you make an oath to the Lord, then indeed you have to keep it before the Lord. If you don't, then you're guilty of sin. The problem was, though, in Jesus' day, this practice of taking oaths had been so corrupted. And Jesus is saying that the whole practice of taking oaths has been so messed up in those days, it's best to avoid this altogether in your everyday life. That's what he's saying in verses 34 to 36. Now, a wee bit of background here about what was happening. What the Pharisees were doing was that in order to be seen to keep the law of God, but at the same time to allow them to have a measure of dishonesty in their lives when it suited them, their response was to swear not by God, but to swear by other things such as heaven or earth or Jerusalem. The earth view was to make such promises not swearing by God but by these other things, those promises were less binding. And so they were looking for a loophole. They had, in their own thinking, created a loophole in which they could make promises which they did not have to keep. Now, Jesus' response to this is twofold. First of all, Jesus is saying here basically, try as you can, but you can't take God out of the picture when making oaths. That's what he's saying there in 34 when he says about don't swear by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Jesus saying that we live in a world where everything is connected and everything is connected to God. So saying you swear by heaven rather than swear by God, it doesn't make any difference because heaven is the home of God. God is connected to everything. God is in everything in this world. So when you swear, whether you use God's name or not, you cannot think that you can swear and be free just to not keep what you have promised. So Jesus is saying, try as you can, but you cannot take God out of the picture when it comes to taking an oath. Everything is done in his presence and before him. The second thing here is, Jesus is saying is that your life should be one of such honesty and integrity that people do not need you to promise in order to trust what you say. That's what he's saying there in verse 37. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything else more than this comes from evil. Your yes, your no should be enough for people. Daniel Doriani, in his book on the Sermon on the Mount, he very devastatingly says that when a father says to his child that he will do something for his child, and the child turns round and Verna says, do you promise? He says the father is already defeated. In other words, the child has heard the father say things before, and the child isn't sure that the father will keep his word. Now, that's challenging to me. Very challenging to me. And really what Jesus is saying here, listen, we need to be people who, when we promise things, are people of our word. We need to be people of integrity. Now that means two things. It means we need to be people who are more careful about this promise, what we promise. And we need to be people who are more serious about doing what we have promised. And Jesus is here, he's talking about our everyday life, just our integrity in our everyday conversations. What Jesus says about not using oaths, it is not about formal occasions, such as oaths that could be lawfully taken in worship or oaths that could be taken at court. Jesus himself, in Matthew 26 in verses 63 to 64, when he was being interrogated and asked to, under oath, to say who he was, he did respond to that. He answered the question under oath. So it's not wrong to take an oath in a court. It's not wrong to take promises in church. There's baptisms and weddings and so forth. It is not wrong to take oaths in these series, but in normal everyday situations, we shouldn't have to say a promise, or I swear it so. The person who normally says that, I promise or I swear so much, we know generally they're people you can't trust. But we as Christians should be people that our yes is enough, our no is enough. This passage in oath reminds us that the tongue is so hard to control, and humanly speaking, our tongue, including in the promises we make, we can't control it in ourselves. But it's only by the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ, who never once said a wrong word, who never once made a promise that he didn't keep. It's only in him, in a life tied to him, that we can be people who keep our promises, whether in marriage or in our everyday life. Amen.